My daughter-in-law raised her champagne flute and announced to the entire ballroom that I was getting senile and should probably be in a facility. My son James immediately switched our drinks when he saw what she'd slipped into mine. 20 minutes later, Victoria Wellington was babbling uncontrollably about bribes and money laundering while 200 of Boston's elite watched in horror. Tell us your city below, then enjoy the story and subscribe for more. Now, let's get to the story. How did I end up watching my son's wife destroy herself at the most important business gathering of the year? Well, it started 3 months earlier when I discovered that merging our family construction company with Wellington Industries wasn't just about business. It was about burying bodies, literally. The morning I found the photos hidden in James's old college textbooks, I thought my biggest problem was deciding whether to wear the navy or the burgundy dress to tonight's merger celebration. How beautifully naive I was, standing there in my son's childhood bedroom, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows I'd cleaned 1,000 times. I'd been looking for his high school yearbooks to display at the party. You know how mothers love embarrassing their successful children with awkward teenage photos. Instead, I found a manila envelope wedged between Advanced Calculus and Introduction to Business Ethics. The irony of that placement wasn't lost on me later. The first photo made my coffee mug slip from my fingers. It showed a construction site I didn't recognize, but the Wellington Industries trucks were unmistakable. The second photo showed men in expensive suits shaking hands with someone whose face had been circled in red ink. The third showed what looked like concrete being poured over something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. "Mom?" James's voice from downstairs made me shove the envelope back where I'd found it. My hands were shaking. "You ready for tonight?" "Almost, sweetheart," I called back, my voice steadier than my nerves. "Just looking for those yearbooks." But I wasn't looking for yearbooks anymore. I was trying to process why my son had photographs documenting what appeared to be someone using our future business partner's equipment to cover up evidence, and why he'd hidden them in his childhood bedroom like some twisted time capsule. The merger celebration was being held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. 3 years of negotiations between Sullivan & Co., the construction company my late husband built, from nothing, and Wellington Industries, the development giant that could take us from local Boston contractors to national players. It should have been the pinnacle of everything David and I had worked for. When David died, I'd inherited 50% ownership of Sullivan & Co., according to the original partnership structure he'd established. But I'd never understood the legal implications of that ownership or what powers it actually gave me. I'd left all the business decisions to James, assuming he knew better than I did about running the company his father had built. Victoria Wellington Harrington. Yes, she kept all the names because heaven forbid anyone forget she was Boston royalty, had been perfect for James from the moment they met at that charity auction. Beautiful, connected, intelligent. The kind of woman who could discuss quarterly earnings reports at dinner and still look flawless doing it. I should have trusted my instincts when something about her felt too polished, too calculated. But James was happy, and after losing his father so young, his happiness had become my primary mission in life. Apparently, that mission had some serious blind spots. "Margaret Sullivan, you look absolutely radiant." Patricia Wellington, Victoria's mother and the true power behind Wellington Industries, air-kissed me as I entered the ballroom. Her smile was magazine perfect and about as warm as a Boston winter. So exciting that our families are finally becoming one. If by becoming one she meant absorbing, then sure. The Wellington family had been acquiring smaller companies for decades, always with the same gentle persistence of a python swallowing its prey. Tonight's celebration was really a funeral, for Sullivan & Co.'s independence. "Where's the happy couple?" I asked, accepting a champagne flute from a passing waiter. "Oh, you know Victoria, making sure every detail is perfect. She's such a perfectionist." Patricia's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. "James is lucky to have found someone so thorough." That word choice felt deliberate. Thorough. Like Victoria was conducting due diligence on my family rather than marrying into it. I found James near the bar, devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo and looking exactly like his father at that age. 28 years old and already carrying himself like the successful businessman he'd become. The sight of him still made my heart swell with pride and ache with grief simultaneously. "There's my beautiful mother," he said, kissing my cheek. "You clean up pretty well for an old lady. Watch it, kiddo. This old lady still knows where you hid your PlayStations when you were grounded." His laugh was genuine, not the polished executive chuckle he'd developed for business functions. For just a moment, he was my boy again, not the stranger who'd been living in my house for 3 years while his wife renovated their Beacon Hill townhouse. The renovation that had been ongoing since their wedding. The renovation that always seemed to need just a few more months, just a little more time. The renovation that kept them living under my roof, where Victoria could observe every detail of Sullivan & Co.'s operations firsthand. "Speaking of hiding things," I said carefully, "I was in your room earlier looking for yearbooks." Something flickered across his face. "Find what you were looking for?" "I found several things I wasn't looking for." Our eyes met, and I saw my son process exactly what I meant. His face went pale beneath his tan. "Mom, James, darling." Victoria materialized beside us in a cloud of expensive perfume and silk. Her gown was stunning, midnight blue with crystals that caught the light like tears. "Your mother looks lovely. Doesn't she look lovely, James?" "She always does," he replied, but his attention was fixed on me with laser intensity. "I was just telling James how I spent the afternoon in his old room," I said pleasantly. So many memories tucked away in unexpected places. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. "How wonderful that you're so nostalgic, Margaret. Though perhaps it's time to start thinking about downsizing. All those rooms must be quite a lot for someone your age to maintain." Someone my age. I was 54, not 94, but Victoria had been making these subtle comments for months, always framed as concern, always delivered with that sympathetic head tilt that made me want to demonstrate exactly how spry I still was by throwing her through a window. "Oh, I'm managing just fine. Amazing what you can accomplish when you know where all the bodies are buried." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Victoria's champagne flute paused halfway to her lips. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What an interesting choice of words, Mom," James said quietly. "I've always been interested in thorough investigations," I replied, borrowing Patricia's word choice from earlier. The announcement that dinner was being served saved us from whatever confrontation was building. As we moved toward the dining room, I felt James's hand on my elbow. "We need to talk," he whispered, "after tonight, when we get home." But as I watched Victoria walk ahead of us, her posture perfect and her movements calculated, I realized that whatever conversation we were going to have, it needed to happen before we got home. Because something told me that if Victoria Wellington had her way, I might not make it home at all. The dining room was a masterpiece of old Boston elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables set with more silverware than most people owned. I found myself seated between Arthur Brennan, Wellington Industries' head of acquisitions, and Margaret Chen, their chief financial officer. Convenient placement for someone they wanted to keep monitored. "Your son speaks very highly of you," Arthur said as the first course arrived. "Says you have an eye for detail that rivals any accountant. David always said I was too nosy for my own good." I smiled and took a sip of wine. "But in construction, the details that people try to hide are usually the ones that'll kill you." Margaret Chen laughed a little too loudly. "How delightfully morbid, though I suppose construction is a dangerous business. Only when people cut corners or cover things up improperly," I replied. "Amazing what you can discover when you know how to read the signs." Across the room, I could see Victoria moving from table to table like a gracious hostess, accepting congratulations and making small talk. But her eyes kept finding me, tracking my conversations, monitoring my interactions. The behavior of someone who needed to control information flow. "Margaret Sullivan, I've heard so much about you." A voice behind me belonged to Thomas Wellington, Victoria's uncle and a senior partner in the family firm. "Your late husband built quite a legacy." "David built more than just buildings," I replied, turning to face him. "He built relationships based on trust. He always said that in construction, your foundation determines everything. If you build on lies, the whole structure eventually collapses." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "Wise words, though sometimes in business, We have to make practical compromises. Compromises, yes. But there's a difference between bending the rules and burying them entirely. The conversation at our table went quiet. I could feel James watching me from the head table where he sat with Victoria and her parents. His expression was tense, worried. My son knew exactly what I was doing, and he was terrified. Good. He should be. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria stood at the podium, resplendent and commanding. Thank you all for joining us tonight as we celebrate the merger of two great Boston families. Wellington Industries and Sullivan & Co. have shared values of integrity, excellence, and commitment to community. The words were perfect, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. But I noticed how she emphasized shared values while looking directly at me, a warning disguised as pleasantries. This partnership represents more than just business, Victoria continued. It represents the future of responsible development in our community. We're committed to building on solid foundations of trust, transparency, and mutual respect. The applause was polite, enthusiastic. No one else seemed to catch the deliberate emphasis on specific words. But I did, and from the way James was gripping his champagne flute, he did too. Now, I'd like to invite my mother-in-law, Margaret Sullivan, to share a few words about the legacy we're all honored to continue. The request caught me off guard. Victoria was calling me to the podium without warning, forcing me to speak publicly while knowing I'd discovered something that could destroy this entire celebration. It was a power play, designed to put me on the spot and test my willingness to maintain appearances. Every eye in the room turned to me as I stood. The walk to the podium felt endless, each step taking me deeper into territory where one wrong word could destroy my son's future, or expose the truth he was desperately trying to hide. "Thank you, Victoria," I said, adjusting the microphone. "David always told me that the most important part of any construction project isn't what people can see. It's the foundation, what's buried beneath the surface that no one wants to examine too closely." Victoria's smile remained frozen, but something dangerous flickered behind her eyes. When we built Sullivan & Co., David insisted on transparency in every project. He used to say that secrets are like structural flaws. They might be invisible at first, but eventually they bring down everything around them. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room, lingering on faces I now suspected knew more than they were admitting. Tonight, as we celebrate this new partnership, I want to honor that tradition of transparency, because the strongest foundations are built on truth, not convenience. The applause was more subdued this time. I had essentially challenged the entire room to examine what they might be overlooking. As I returned to my seat, I could feel the shift in atmosphere. Conversations became more careful, laughter more forced. "That was quite a speech," Margaret Chen said quietly. "Very pointed." "I've never been good at sugarcoating things," I replied. "David used to say I had a talent for asking uncomfortable questions at inconvenient times." "And do you? Have uncomfortable questions, I mean?" I met her gaze directly. "I always have questions. The uncomfortable part depends on what people are trying to hide." As the evening progressed, I noticed the subtle changes in behavior around me. Conversations stopped when I approached tables. People excused themselves when I joined groups. It was the social equivalent of quarantine, isolating the potential infection before it could spread. But isolation works both ways. While they were keeping me away from information, they were also revealing their own guilt through avoidance. The people who had nothing to hide continued treating me normally. The people who acted nervous around me were painting targets on themselves. By the time dessert was served, I had identified at least 6 individuals who were part of whatever Victoria and her family were covering up. The head of city planning, who couldn't meet my eyes. The construction supervisor, who found reasons to leave every conversation I joined. The environmental inspector, who spilled wine on himself when I mentioned David's old projects. They were all connected somehow to whatever was in those photographs James had hidden. And Victoria Wellington was orchestrating their collective guilt like a conductor directing a symphony of secrets. But the evening's most revealing moment came as coffee was being served. Victoria stood to make another toast, and I noticed James watching her with an expression I'd never seen before. Not love, not admiration, but something that looked disturbingly like fear. That's when I realized my son wasn't just hiding evidence of someone else's crimes. He was hiding evidence of his own. When we finally returned home that night, I knew I had to find out more about what James had gotten himself involved in. But first, I needed to process what David might have known about all this. I went back to James's room and retrieved the envelope with the photographs. This time, I searched more thoroughly through his old belongings, looking for anything else that might explain the images I'd found. Behind the textbooks, wrapped in an old t-shirt, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A letter addressed to me in David's handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Margaret," I read with shaking hands, "if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me and you've discovered evidence of dangerous activities involving Sullivan & Co. I've been suspicious of some of our recent contracts, particularly those involving wealthy clients who demand complete secrecy and pay far above market rates. I haven't been able to gather enough proof to take action, but I fear James may be getting involved with people who eliminate problems rather than solving them legally. If you find evidence of criminal activity, contact the FBI immediately and trust no one else. The company means nothing compared to your safety. All my love, David." My husband had known something was wrong. He'd died before he could protect James from manipulation, but he'd left me instructions for exactly the situation I now faced. David had suspected that our son was being drawn into something dangerous, and he'd tried to give me the tools to save him. The photographs suddenly made more sense in this context. James hadn't just stumbled into criminal activity. He'd been targeted and manipulated by people who specialized in corrupting vulnerable young men who'd recently lost their fathers. As I sat in my son's childhood bedroom, holding my dead husband's warning and staring at evidence of multiple murders, I realized that Victoria Wellington hadn't just married into our family. She'd infiltrated it with military precision, and now she was systematically destroying everything David and I had built to protect the people we loved. The revelation hit me as Victoria raised her glass for the second toast of the evening. James wasn't protecting evidence. He was part of creating it. The fear in his eyes wasn't about what his wife might do. It was about what she knew he'd already done. "To new beginnings," Victoria announced, her voice carrying perfectly across the ballroom, "and to burying the past where it belongs." The word burying felt intentional, loaded with meaning that made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. I applauded with everyone else, but my mind was racing through every conversation, every strange phone call, every time James had worked late on projects that didn't quite add up. 3 years ago, right around the time he met Victoria, Sullivan & Co. had started taking on unusual contracts, projects that paid extremely well for relatively simple work, projects that James handled personally, without involving our usual crew supervisors, projects that often required working at night or on weekends when fewer people would be around to observe. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" James appeared beside my chair as the applause died down. "You look pale." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just processing what a momentous evening this is." I smiled up at him, wondering when my son had learned to lie so smoothly. "Though I am curious about something. That Riverside development project you handled last summer, the one that paid so well for emergency foundation work?" His face went completely still. "What about it?" "I was just wondering why we never submitted a final report to the city. Usually, David insisted on proper documentation for every project, especially emergency work. Some clients prefer discretion, Mom. You know how wealthy families value their privacy. Privacy. Not legal compliance or proper procedure. Privacy. As if covering up a crime was just another form of customer service." "Of course," I agreed pleasantly, "though I imagine the families of missing persons might value transparency over privacy. Don't you think?" James's hand tightened on the back of my chair. "I think maybe we should get you home. It's been a long evening. Actually, I'm enjoying myself immensely. It's fascinating how much you can learn about people when you really pay attention." I stood and smoothed my dress. For instance, I never realized how many of tonight's guests were connected to that Riverside project. The truth was, I hadn't known until tonight. But watching reactions during dinner, seeing who avoided eye contact when I mentioned David's commitment to proper documentation, had given me a masterclass in reading guilt. At least 7 people in this room had been involved in whatever had happened at that construction site. "Margaret! Patricia Wellington materialized with the timing of someone who'd been monitoring our conversation. How wonderful to see you engaging with our business associates. Victoria tells me you have such an impressive memory for details. Just the important ones, I replied. Though sometimes the most important details are the ones people work hardest to forget. Patricia's laugh was crystalline and sharp. How philosophical. Though at our age, don't you think it's healthier to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past? Our age. Patricia was at least 10 years older than me, but she was using the phrase to suggest we were both elderly women who should know better than to cause trouble. Another subtle attempt to make me feel like I was being inappropriate by asking questions. I've always believed that understanding the past is essential for building a secure future, I said. David taught me that foundations matter more than facades. Speaking of David, Patricia continued smoothly, Victoria mentioned that you've been spending a lot of time going through old files lately. Perhaps it's time to consider whether maintaining all those records is really necessary. I know several excellent estate planning attorneys who specialize in helping widows simplify their affairs. Simplify their affairs. Translation: destroy evidence and stop asking inconvenient questions. How thoughtful of Victoria to be concerned about my record keeping, though I have to wonder why she's paying such close attention to my private activities. The question hung between us like a gauntlet thrown down. Patricia's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. Victoria cares deeply about family, Margaret. She's simply looking out for your best interests. And what exactly does she consider to be my best interests? Peace of mind, of course. The ability to enjoy your retirement without being burdened by business concerns that are better left to younger minds. Younger minds. The insults were getting less subtle by the minute. I appreciate the concern, Patricia, but my mind is as sharp as ever. In fact, I've been remembering all sorts of interesting details lately. Things I thought I'd forgotten. Before Patricia could respond, the lights dimmed slightly and Victoria returned to the podium. But this time, something was different in her demeanor. The polished confidence was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more desperate. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude this wonderful evening, I'd like to share something personal with all of you. As many of you know, my husband and I have been living with his mother while we renovated our home. Victoria's smile was warm, but her eyes found mine with laser precision. Margaret has been so generous, opening her home to us, sharing her wisdom and experience. But we've recently realized that perhaps it's time for all of us to embrace the next chapter of our lives. Where was this going? James and I have been discussing the future, and we believe it would be best for everyone if Margaret could find a living situation more suited to this stage of her life. Somewhere with less responsibility, fewer burdens. Somewhere she can truly relax and enjoy the company of people her own age. The room went silent. Victoria had just publicly announced that they were kicking me out of my own house, the house David built. The house where I'd raised James, the house that served as headquarters for Sullivan & Co. Of course, Victoria continued, we want to make sure Margaret is comfortable and well cared for. We've been researching some lovely retirement communities, places where she can have the support she needs as she adjusts to the changes that come with aging. Retirement communities. She was suggesting, in front of 200 of Boston's most influential people, that I needed to be put in a facility. Not because I was incapacitated, but because I was inconvenient. The applause was polite, but confused. Most of the guests didn't understand what they'd just witnessed, but they sensed the undercurrent of hostility. I remained seated, processing the audacity of what Victoria had just done. She hadn't just threatened me. She'd publicly created a narrative that would justify anything that happened to me next. If I disappeared, if I had an accident, if I suddenly became confused or unstable, tonight's speech would be cited as evidence that everyone could see I was declining. James was staring at his wife with an expression of horror and admiration. Horror at her ruthlessness, admiration for her strategic brilliance. That's when I realized something that changed everything. James wasn't just afraid of what Victoria knew about his crimes. He was afraid of what she was capable of doing to protect their secrets. And based on what I'd just witnessed, he had every reason to be terrified. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to neutralize me publicly, she'd revealed just how dangerous I actually was to her carefully constructed world. Now I knew I was right about the photographs, the cover-up, and the murders. And she knew that I knew. The ride home was silent until we reached the driveway of the house David built 30 years ago. James turned off the engine but made no move to get out. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, her perfect posture maintained even in private, staring straight ahead at the home she was planning to take from me. "Well," I said from the back seat, "that was quite a performance tonight, Victoria. Very theatrical." She turned to look at me, and for the first time all evening, her mask slipped completely. What I saw wasn't the polished socialite or the concerned daughter-in-law. It was something cold and calculating and completely ruthless. "You shouldn't have pushed so hard tonight, Margaret." "Pushed? I was simply making conversation at a party. Though I suppose when you're hiding something significant, every conversation feels like an interrogation." James finally spoke. "Mom, please, just stop." "Stop what, sweetheart? Stop asking questions? Stop paying attention? Stop existing in my own home? Stop acting like you don't understand what's at stake here," Victoria said quietly. The pretense was over. We were no longer playing the game of polite family dynamics and social courtesies. This was a direct confrontation, and Victoria was done pretending to be anything other than what she was, someone who eliminated obstacles to get what she wanted. "What exactly is at stake, Victoria? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my son has gotten himself involved in something that requires disappearing evidence and silencing inconvenient witnesses." "You don't know anything," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know about the photographs. I know about the Riverside project. I know that half the people at tonight's party looked guilty as hell when I mentioned proper documentation." I leaned forward between their seats. "What I don't know yet is whether my son is a victim of blackmail or a willing participant in murder." The word hung in the car like toxic gas. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Victoria's breathing became more controlled, more deliberate. "You have no proof of anything," she said finally. "I have photographs of what looks like a body being covered with concrete. I have financial records showing payments for emergency foundation work that was never properly reported. I have a room full of witnesses who just watched you publicly declare me mentally incompetent." I smiled grimly. "What I don't have yet is the rest of the story. But I'm a patient woman, and I have all the time in the world to piece it together." "Actually," Victoria said, turning fully to face me, "you don't have all the time in the world, because after tonight's speech, everyone expects you to need increasing care and supervision. Everyone expects you to become more confused, more prone to accidents." The threat was delivered in the same tone she'd used to discuss dinner plans. Matter of fact, practical, inevitable. "Are you threatening me in front of my son?" "I'm explaining reality to someone who seems to have difficulty grasping her situation." James exploded. "Jesus Christ, Victoria, she's my mother." "She's a problem that needs to be solved," Victoria replied calmly. "The question is whether you're going to help solve it or become part of it yourself." The words hit James like physical blows. I watched my son, the little boy I'd raised, the man I'd been proud of, crumble under the weight of whatever hold Victoria had over him. "How did it start, James?" I asked gently. When did you first realize what you'd gotten involved in?" He was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "The Riverside project was supposed to be simple. Emergency foundation work for a private client. Cash payment, no questions asked, no official documentation." "What kind of emergency?" "Victoria's Uncle Thomas said they needed to reinforce a foundation that was showing stress fractures. Time-sensitive work that couldn't wait for permits and inspections. The client was willing to pay triple our usual rate for immediate service and discretion." I could fill in the blanks. "But when you got there, it wasn't foundation work. There was already a hole dug, deep, with something wrapped in plastic at the bottom." James's voice broke slightly. "Thomas said it was just construction debris that needed to be disposed of properly, that environmental regulations made legal disposal too complicated and expensive." "And you believed that?" "I wanted to believe it. The money was—" "We needed the money, Mom. The company was struggling more than I told you. Dad's medical bills, the loans he took out before he died, the contracts that fell through after his death. We were 3 months away from bankruptcy." The confession hit me like a punch to the stomach. James had been protecting me from knowing how close we were to losing everything David had built. While I was grieving my husband, my son was drowning in debt and accepting criminal contracts to save the company. So you poured the foundation over whatever was in that hole, I said. I supervised the pour. I made sure it was done right, that nothing would ever surface. I told myself that whatever it was already dead. I was just cleaning up. And then, Victoria answered, then there were more emergency projects, more private clients who needed discretion, more opportunities to save Sullivan & Co. and build our future together. The pattern was clear now. Victoria's family had identified James as vulnerable, grieving, financially desperate, and legally responsible for a company he wasn't prepared to run. They'd offered him a lifeline that came with strings attached. Each project had implicated him deeper, until he was completely under their control. How many bodies, James? They said it was just debris. How many jobs like Riverside? 7, Victoria answered when James couldn't. 7 very profitable contracts over 3 years, enough to save Sullivan & Co. and establish James as a reliable partner for future endeavors. 7 bodies. My son had helped bury 7 people to save a company and maintain his marriage to a woman who was systematically destroying his soul. And now you need me gone because I'm asking questions that could expose everything. We need you to understand that your choices are limited, Victoria corrected. You can accept the reality of your situation gracefully, or we can help you accept it in other ways. But either way, you're going to stop investigating, stop asking questions, and stop interfering with our business. I looked at my son, hoping to see some sign that he would protect me, that some part of the boy I'd raised was still fighting against what he'd become. Instead, I saw defeat and resignation, and the terrible understanding that he'd already chosen Victoria over me. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Victoria replied smoothly. Take all the time you need. But remember, after tonight's announcement, people are watching for signs that you're having difficulties. It would be tragic if something happened to confirm their concerns. As we got out of the car and walked to the front door, I realized that my son and daughter-in-law weren't just planning to take my house. They were planning to take everything: my freedom, my reputation, and ultimately, my life. But Victoria had underestimated one crucial factor. I was David Sullivan's wife and James Sullivan's mother. I'd been married to a man who built things to last and raised a son who used to believe in right and wrong. Somewhere underneath all the fear and guilt and criminal complicity, that son was still there. And I was going to find a way to save him, even if he didn't want to be saved. I lay awake until 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and listening to James and Victoria murmur in their bedroom down the hall. Their voices were too low to make out specific words, but the tone was clear. Victoria was giving instructions, and James was agreeing to follow them. By morning, I had a plan. The photographs James had hidden were damning, but they weren't enough by themselves. I needed more evidence, more documentation, and most importantly, I needed proof of what Victoria's family was really using Wellington Industries to accomplish. If I was going to save my son from a life sentence for accessory to multiple murders, I needed to prove he was being coerced rather than acting willingly. That meant I had to get closer to Victoria, not farther away. "Good morning," Victoria said as I entered the kitchen. She was already dressed for business, her hair perfectly styled, drinking coffee from one of my wedding china cups like she owned the place, which apparently she believed she did. "Morning, dear. Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you. James had to leave early for a site inspection, but he asked me to discuss living arrangements with you." She set down her cup with deliberate precision. "We've identified several excellent facilities that would be perfect for someone with your evolving needs." I poured myself coffee and sat across from her at the table where I'd eaten breakfast with David for 25 years. How thoughtful. Though I'm curious about something first. Oh? Last night's speech mentioned that people our age should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. But some of us have pasts that are more complicated than others, don't we? Victoria's expression didn't change, but her hand paused halfway to her coffee cup. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that Wellington Industries has been acquiring smaller companies for decades, and I imagine some of those acquisitions involved difficult circumstances. When families won't sell, when properties have complicated histories, when previous owners become problematic. Business acquisitions are always challenging," Victoria agreed carefully. Of course. And I imagine that sometimes the easiest solution is to make sure the problematic elements are properly buried where they can't cause future difficulties. We were talking in code now, but the message was clear. I was telling her that I understood exactly what her family's business model involved, and she was evaluating whether that made me more dangerous or more useful. You know, Margaret, I think I may have misjudged you last night. Perhaps we've been approaching this situation all wrong. How so? Victoria leaned forward, her posture shifting from dismissive to conspiratorial. James seems to think you're a liability, but I'm beginning to wonder if you might actually be an asset. Someone with your understanding of practical realities might be very valuable in our expanded operations. The offer was breathtaking in its audacity. Victoria wasn't just threatening to have me killed. She was suggesting I could join the family business instead. What exactly would that involve? Sullivan & Co. has been handling our special projects beautifully for 3 years now. But as we expand operations, we need someone with management experience who understands the importance of discretion. Someone who knows how to keep records organized and employees motivated. She was offering me a job managing the murder division of her family's development empire. The woman had no conception of normal human morality. And James, how does he feel about this possibility? James is learning to see the bigger picture. His father may have built Sullivan & Co. on idealistic principles, but idealism doesn't pay the bills. James understands now that success requires pragmatic choices. Pragmatic choices like burying bodies under building foundations. Victoria smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression seemed genuine. Exactly like that. The development business has always been about clearing obstacles, Margaret. We've simply become more efficient at permanent solutions. She was confessing to multiple murders while offering me a management position. The woman was either completely insane or completely confident that I had no choice but to accept. What happens if I'm not interested in joining the family business? Then you become one of the obstacles that needs to be cleared. Victoria's tone remained conversational, as if we were discussing vacation plans. Last night's speech established the narrative. Everyone expects you to experience increasing confusion and declining judgment. If you refuse to accept reasonable care arrangements, that confirms their concerns. If you have an accident while resisting help, that's tragic but predictable. And James would go along with that? James will go along with whatever ensures his survival and his continued freedom. He's already implicated in 7 murders. Margaret, at this point, his only choice is to stay loyal to the people who can protect him from the consequences. The casual mention of 7 murders confirmed what I'd suspected. Victoria saw killing as just another business tool, no different from legal briefs or construction contracts. She'd systematically corrupted my son by making him complicit in murders, then used that complicity to control his future choices. But she'd also just given me exactly what I needed: a clear confession of multiple murders and an admission of blackmail. The problem was proving it in a way that would hold up in court and protect James from prosecution. I need some time to consider your offer, I said finally. Of course, but don't take too long. We have several properties in development that will require special foundation work soon. It would be helpful to know whether we can count on your supervision. More murders were being planned. Victoria wasn't just confessing to past crimes, she was announcing future ones. After Victoria left for her office, I went straight to James's old room and retrieved the photographs. But this time, I looked at them with the knowledge Victoria had just provided. These weren't random crime scenes. They were specific development properties where Wellington Industries had encountered resistance from previous owners or neighbors who asked too many questions. The first photo showed the Riverside site, where James had admitted to covering up a body. The second showed what I now recognized as the Morrison property downtown, a family-owned lot that had been sold to Wellington under mysterious circumstances after the elderly owner disappeared. The third showed the Beacon Street development, where environmental activists had been protesting before suddenly abandoning their cause. 7 special projects over 3 years. 7 properties where inconvenient people had been permanently removed to facilitate development. 7 crime scenes where my son had helped bury evidence to save a company that would eventually be absorbed by the same people who'd created the evidence in the first place. Victoria's plan was elegant in its simplicity. identify vulnerable businesses, create circumstances that force them to accept criminal contracts, use their complicity to control their future behavior, then absorb their companies while maintaining their silence through blackmail. James hadn't fallen in love with Victoria Wellington. He'd been targeted, recruited, and enslaved by a criminal organization that specialized in murder for profit disguised as real estate development. And now, they wanted to either recruit me as a manager or eliminate me as a witness. The choice seemed obvious, but I'd learned enough about Victoria to know that accepting her offer would just make me more useful in the short term and more dangerous to their security in the long term. Eventually, I'd become another obstacle that needed permanent clearing, unless I found a way to clear them first. But that meant I had to prove 7 murders, expose a multi-generational criminal enterprise, and save my son from a life sentence, all while staying alive long enough to see justice done. At 54 years old, I was about to become either a serial killer's business partner or the next body under a Wellington Industries foundation. Time to find out which. 3 days after Victoria's job offer, I made my decision. But first, I needed insurance. I'd spent 72 hours playing the part of a confused older woman considering her limited options, while secretly photographing every document in James's room and researching the Wellington family's business history. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Wellington Industries hadn't just been eliminating inconvenient property owners. They'd been doing it for 40 years. Patricia Wellington's late husband had started the practice in the 1980s, targeting elderly homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods. The current generation had simply modernized the operation and expanded the scale. "I've made my decision," I announced over breakfast, where Victoria was reviewing architectural plans for their next development project. "Wonderful," she replied without looking up. "I think you'll find our business arrangements very satisfying. Actually, I've decided to decline your generous offer, but I have a counterproposal." That got her attention. Victoria set down her coffee cup with the careful precision of someone recalculating rapidly shifting circumstances. "I'm listening. I want 50% ownership of Sullivan & Co. transferred to me immediately, along with a detailed accounting of all special projects completed in the last 3 years. I also want James released from any future obligations to your family's business." Victoria's laugh was genuine amusement. "And in exchange for these remarkable demands, you're offering what exactly?" "My continued silence and my immediate departure from Boston. I'll sell you this house for $1, pack my belongings, and disappear to Florida, where I'll live quietly and never contact James again." It was a lie, of course. But it was the kind of lie that would appeal to Victoria's arrogance while giving me the documentation I needed to destroy her family's operation. 50% ownership is out of the question. James owns Sullivan & Co. completely. Actually, he doesn't. I smiled and pulled out a manila folder I'd retrieved from David's safety deposit box the day before. According to the original incorporation documents, David structured the company as a joint venture with automatic survivor benefits. When he died, his 50% ownership transferred to me as his spouse, not to James as his son. Victoria's face went very still. "That's impossible. We've reviewed all the legal documents. You've reviewed the documents James had access to." But David was more cautious than either of us realized. He filed additional protection clauses separately with the State Corporation Commission, clauses designed to prevent exactly the kind of takeover your family engineered. I spread the papers across the breakfast table. It turns out that any major changes to company operations require both partners' consent. And if the company becomes involved in illegal activities, there are automatic disclosure requirements that protect both the surviving spouse and any coerced employees. The documents were genuine. David had indeed structured Sullivan & Co. to protect against hostile takeovers and legal manipulation. What Victoria didn't know was that the corporate protections also included mandatory reporting requirements if evidence of criminal activity was discovered. "This changes nothing," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "James is still implicated in 7 murders. He'll go along with whatever protects him from prosecution." "Will he?" "Because I've been thinking about that. James is 28 years old, financially desperate, and grieving his father's death. That makes him a victim of manipulation, not a willing participant in murder. A good lawyer could probably get him immunity in exchange for testimony against the people who blackmailed him into participating. I was bluffing about the immunity, but Victoria couldn't be sure. More importantly, I was forcing her to consider that James might choose to save himself by betraying her family instead of staying loyal to protect their secrets. You're suggesting he'd turn against his own wife? I'm suggesting he'd choose freedom over a life sentence. But we'll never know unless we ask him directly. I stood and walked to the kitchen door. James, could you come here for a moment? The sound of footsteps on the stairs told me my son had been listening to our entire conversation. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. James, I said gently, Victoria and I have been discussing business arrangements, and we'd like your input on something important. He looked between us like a deer caught between two predators, unsure which direction offered safety. What kind of input? We're trying to determine whether you'd prefer to spend the next 30 years in prison protecting Victoria's family's secrets, or accept immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying about how they blackmailed you into participating in murder. The words hit him like physical blows. James stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe for support. Mom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Victoria's family targeted you because you were vulnerable, manipulated you into criminal participation, then used that participation to control your future choices. What I don't understand is why you're still protecting people who see you as expendable. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. Actually, I said calmly, this conversation is just getting started. James, how many more special projects is Victoria's family planning? How many more people are going to disappear to facilitate their development schedule? They don't tell me everything. They don't tell you everything because they don't trust you completely. You're useful for now, but eventually you'll become a liability they need to eliminate. I met his eyes directly. Just like they're planning to eliminate me. James's face crumbled. They said if I cooperated, if I kept quiet, everyone would be safe. They said no one else had to get hurt. And you believed them? After watching them murder 7 people? I didn't watch them murder anyone. I just cleaned up afterward. Victoria had heard enough. James, get in the car. We're leaving. No, he said quietly. The word hung in the kitchen like a gunshot. Victoria turned to stare at her husband with an expression of complete shock. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not going anywhere until Mom explains what she knows and what she's planning to do about it. For the first time since I'd met her, Victoria Wellington looked genuinely frightened. Her carefully constructed world was cracking, and she could see her control over James slipping away. James, if you stay here and listen to your mother's fantasies, you're going to destroy both our futures. The police won't care that you were manipulated. They'll only care that you participated in 7 murders. But they might care that I was blackmailed into participation by people who threatened to hurt my mother if I didn't cooperate. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been controlling James through financial desperation. She'd been threatening to kill me if he didn't comply with their demands. They threatened me? James nodded miserably. After the first project, when I tried to back out, Victoria's Uncle Thomas showed me photographs of other family members who'd become problematic. He explained that resistance was always temporary, but family relationships were permanent. The pieces clicked into place. James hadn't been protecting Victoria's secrets to save himself. He'd been protecting them to save me. Every time he'd buried evidence, every time he'd stayed silent, every time he'd chosen complicity over conscience, he'd been trying to keep his mother alive. Oh, sweetheart, I whispered, you should have told me. What could you have done? They're too powerful, too connected. At least if I cooperated, you'd be safe. Victoria was backing toward the kitchen door, probably calculating her escape options. But I wasn't done with her yet. Victoria, before you leave, I have one more thing to show you. I pulled out my phone and played a recording from our conversation 3 days earlier, her voice clearly confessing to multiple murders and offering me a management position in their criminal enterprise. I've been recording every conversation we've had for the past week. I have documentation of 7 murders, detailed evidence of your family's blackmail operation, and sworn testimony from your primary witness about coercion and threats. Victoria's face went from pale to ashen. You can't prove anything. It's just recordings that could be faked. documents that could be forged. You're right, which is why I contacted the FBI 2 years ago when I first started noticing irregularities in Wellington Industries' business practices. The kitchen door opened, and Special Agent Patricia Chen entered with 2 other federal agents, all wearing bulletproof vests and carrying drawn weapons. Victoria Wellington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. As they read Victoria her rights and placed her in handcuffs, she stared at me with an expression of pure hatred and grudging respect. "How long have you known?" she demanded. "The FBI has been investigating Wellington Industries for 2 years as part of a broader organized crime task force," Agent Chen explained as they secured Victoria. "When Mrs. Sullivan contacted our tip line about suspicious activities, we realized she could help us gather the direct confessions we needed to make arrests." As they led her away, James slumped into a kitchen chair and put his head in his hands. "What happens to me now?" Agent Chen answered. "That depends on your willingness to cooperate with our investigation into Wellington Industries and provide testimony about your coercion. We believe you're a victim of criminal manipulation, not a willing participant in murder." My son looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything. You were protecting me the only way you knew how," I replied, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Now, let's finish this properly." The FBI raid on Wellington Industries was executed with the precision of a military operation. I watched from Agent Chen's unmarked sedan as federal agents emerged from the building carrying boxes of evidence and escorting handcuffed executives. Patricia Wellington was arrested at her Beacon Hill mansion while hosting a charity luncheon for Boston's social elite. Thomas Wellington was taken into custody at his country club during a board meeting. 7 other Wellington Industries employees were arrested simultaneously at various locations around the city. 43 years of criminal operations, Agent Chen said as we watched the perp walk on the evening news. "Your recordings and James's testimony gave us everything we needed to roll up the entire organization. What about the other construction companies they blackmailed? We've identified 6 other firms that were coerced into similar arrangements. None of their owners will face prosecution. They're all being treated as victims of criminal manipulation." The scope of the Wellington family's operation was staggering. 43 years of targeting vulnerable property owners, eliminating resistance through murder, and blackmailing construction companies into disposing of evidence. The FBI estimated they were responsible for at least 37 deaths disguised as disappearances, accidents, or natural causes. James sat beside me in the sedan, looking simultaneously relieved and devastated. "How did you know Agent Chen wasn't really with Wellington Industries?" "Because the FBI had been investigating the Wellington family for 2 years before you ever got involved with Victoria," I replied. Agent Chen was never Margaret Chen, their CFO. She was always Special Agent Patricia Chen, working undercover to build evidence for federal charges. But she was at the dinner party. She was monitoring the dinner party as part of the ongoing investigation. When I contacted the FBI tip line about what I'd discovered, they realized I could help them gather the direct confessions they needed to make arrests. Agent Chen turned from the front seat. "Your mother's recordings provided the first clear evidence we'd obtained of the Wellington family discussing their operations directly. Previously, we had suspicious patterns and circumstantial evidence, but never direct admissions of murder. The truth was, the FBI's investigation had been stalled for months before I'd made contact. They'd suspected the Wellington family was involved in criminal activity, but they couldn't prove direct involvement in specific murders. Victoria's arrogance in offering me a management position had given them exactly what they needed to move forward with arrests." "What happens now?" James asked. "Now you testify before a federal grand jury about your coercion and provide detailed information about every special project you were forced to complete," Agent Chen explained. "In exchange, you'll receive full immunity from prosecution and enter the witness protection program until the trials are completed." Witness protection. My son would have to disappear, assume a new identity, and start over in a different city under federal supervision. It was the only way to ensure his safety while the remaining members of the Wellington organization faced justice. What about Mom? She'll be relocated as well, if she chooses. The Wellington family had extensive criminal connections beyond their immediate organization. There may be associates who consider both of you ongoing threats. I'd been dreading this moment. After everything we'd been through, after finally understanding the truth about James's manipulation, and finally exposing the people who'd terrorized our family, we were going to be separated again by circumstances beyond our control. How long would witness protection last? I asked. For James, probably permanently. He's the key witness against a multi-generational criminal enterprise. For you, probably until the trials are completed and all appeals are exhausted. Maybe 18 months. 18 months in witness protection, followed by the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with my son under new identities in a new city. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was better than watching James spend his life in prison or waiting for Victoria's associates to eliminate us both. There's one more thing, Agent Chen said. Victoria Wellington has been attempting to negotiate a plea agreement. She's offering information about other criminal organizations in exchange for reduced charges. What kind of information? She claims the Wellington family was part of a larger network of development companies across New England that shared resources and coordinated territorial operations. If her information proves accurate, your case could trigger investigations in 5 other states. The woman who'd threatened to have me killed was now trying to save herself by betraying her criminal associates. It was poetic justice of a sort, but it also meant the danger to our family would continue until every member of the network was imprisoned. Has she mentioned James or me specifically in her negotiations? Agent Chen's pause was answer enough. Victoria was trying to minimize her own culpability by claiming she'd been following orders from higher-ranking members of the criminal network and that James and I posed ongoing threats to their operations that needed to be addressed. She's trying to make us targets for other criminal organizations, James said quietly. She's trying to save herself by making everyone else expendable, I corrected. But that's not going to work this time. 3 days later, I stood in the living room of the house David built, boxing up 30 years of memories, while James packed his belongings in the room where this nightmare had started. The federal marshals had given us 48 hours to settle our affairs before entering protection. Sullivan & Co. would be dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the families of Wellington Industries victims. The house would be sold, with proceeds going into a federal account we could access after the trials concluded. Everything David and I had built together was ending, but at least it was ending with justice rather than murder. I found something else, James said, appearing in the doorway with David's letter in his hands. I should have shown you this years ago. You found it when you were packing? I found it the night after Dad died. But I was so scared, so overwhelmed by everything, I just hid it and tried to pretend everything would work out somehow. I took the letter and read it again, thinking about how different things might have been if James had shown it to me 3 years earlier. But then again, if he had, we might never have gathered enough evidence to destroy the Wellington organization completely. He would be proud of you, Mom, James said quietly. You saved us both. We saved each other, I replied, putting the letter back in its envelope. Your father gave us the tools, but we did the work together. As the federal marshals arrived to escort us to our new temporary lives, I took one last look at the house where I'd raised my son, buried my husband, and finally learned to fight for the people I loved. Victoria Wellington had tried to destroy my family by exploiting our vulnerabilities and manipulating our grief. Instead, she'd forced us to discover strengths we didn't know we possessed and brought us closer together than we'd been since David's death. It wasn't the ending I'd planned, but it was the ending we'd earned. And sometimes, that's enough. 6 months into witness protection, I was living as Martha Collins in a modest apartment in Portland, Oregon, working part-time at a local library and learning to rebuild a life from scratch. James, now John Carson, was 300 miles away in Sacramento, working for a small accounting firm and slowly healing from 3 years of psychological manipulation. We talked once a week through secure FBI channels, careful conversations monitored by federal agents, but precious to both of us. He was doing well, seeing a therapist, and gradually accepting that he'd been a victim rather than a willing participant in murder. Then Agent Chen called with news that changed everything. Victoria Wellington died in federal custody yesterday morning. The words hit me like ice water. How? Apparent suicide. She was found in her cell with a braided bedsheet around her neck. But there are some irregularities that concern us. I sat down heavily in my small kitchen, processing the implications. Victoria's death meant the prosecution's key witness was gone, potentially undermining the cases against her family members and associates. What kind of irregularities? The timing, primarily. Victoria was scheduled to begin detailed testimony about the broader criminal network next week. Her death came 12 hours before she was supposed to reveal the identities of organization leaders in other states. You think she was murdered? I think she was eliminated to protect higher-ranking members of the organization, which means the danger to you and James has potentially increased rather than decreased. Victoria's death also raised questions about security within the federal prison system. If criminal associates could eliminate a high-profile witness in federal custody, they could certainly identify and target people in witness protection. What does this mean for our safety? We're reviewing all protection arrangements immediately. In the short term, you'll both be relocated again to different regions with enhanced security protocols. More relocation. More new identities. More months or years of living in hiding while the criminal network Victoria had helped expose potentially regrouped and retaliated. Agent Chen, I need to ask you something directly. Are James and I going to spend the rest of our lives running from these people? There was a long pause before she answered. I don't know. The Wellington organization was larger and more sophisticated than we initially realized. Victoria's death suggests there are people with significant resources and reach who consider your testimony an ongoing threat. That evening, I sat in my small living room, looking through the few personal photographs I'd been allowed to take into protection. Pictures of James as a child, my wedding photo with David, family Christmas mornings in the house I'd never see again. The life I'd built over 54 years had been reduced to a shoebox of memories and a federal stipend for basic living expenses. But I wasn't angry. For the first time in months, I was actually calm. Victoria Wellington had spent her life believing that money and connections could solve any problem, eliminate any obstacle, control any situation. She died in a federal prison cell, betrayed by the same criminal network she'd served faithfully for years. The people who'd killed her to protect their secrets had made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that James and I were motivated by the same things that drove them: money, power, self-preservation. They were wrong. We were motivated by something much more dangerous to criminal organizations: the simple desire to see justice done and to protect innocent people from becoming victims. And that motivation wasn't going to disappear because they'd murdered Victoria or because they were threatening to hunt us for the rest of our lives. 2 days later, I made a decision that would either ensure our permanent safety or get us both killed. I called Agent Chen and told her I wanted to come out of witness protection. Margaret, that's not advisable given recent developments. I want to testify publicly about everything I know regarding the Wellington organization's operations. I want to hold press conferences, write detailed statements for publication, and make sure every piece of information I possess about their criminal network becomes part of the public record. That would make you an even larger target. No, it would make me a useless target. Right now, they want to silence me because I have information they need to keep secret. If I make all that information public immediately, killing me won't accomplish anything except drawing more attention to their activities. It was a calculated risk based on my understanding of criminal psychology. Organizations like the Wellington Network killed witnesses to prevent testimony and protect secrets. They rarely killed people for revenge after their secrets were already exposed, because murder only confirmed guilt and attracted law enforcement attention. You'd be giving up all protection in exchange for a strategy that might not work. I'd be trading indefinite hiding for the possibility of getting my life back. And more importantly, I'd be making sure that other families don't go through what James and I experienced. Agent Chen was quiet for several minutes. I'd need to discuss this with my superiors and with federal prosecutors. The decision would also require James's consent, since your public testimony would necessarily involve his experiences. Then let's ask him. The secure conference call with James took place the next morning. When I explained my proposal, his initial reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Mom, you're talking about painting a target on both our backs. The target is already there, sweetheart. The only question is whether we're going to spend our lives hiding from it or do something that makes the target irrelevant. What if it doesn't work? What if they kill you anyway? Then at least I'll die fighting instead of hiding, and you'll be safe because all the information will already be public. James was quiet for a long time. Finally, What would Dad do? The question went straight to my heart. Your father would say that the people who threaten innocent families need to be stopped, even if stopping them involves personal risk. He'd say that hiding from bullies only works until they decide hiding isn't enough. Then let's do it. Agent Chen's superiors were less enthusiastic about the plan, but they ultimately agreed that public disclosure might provide better long-term protection than indefinite witness protection. More importantly, James's detailed public testimony about coercion and manipulation could help other victims of similar criminal schemes recognize their situations and seek help. The press conference was scheduled for the following week in Boston, with full federal security and media coverage guaranteed by cooperation with major news outlets. I was going home to face the people who destroyed my family, and this time I wasn't hiding behind false identities or federal protection. This time, I was going to tell the whole truth about Victoria Wellington's criminal organization. Consequences be damned, and if they wanted to try to silence me after that, they'd have to do it in front of the entire country. The press conference was held in the same ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza where Victoria had announced my mental decline 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat at a table facing dozens of reporters, cameras, and federal agents. James sat beside me, looking nervous but determined. Agent Chen flanked my other side, with additional federal marshals positioned throughout the room. If the remaining members of the Wellington criminal network wanted to eliminate us, they'd have to do it in front of national media. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. 6 months ago, my daughter-in-law, Victoria Wellington, used this same room to announce publicly that I was experiencing mental decline and needed to be placed in a care facility. Today, I'm here to explain why she really wanted me silenced. For the next hour, I detailed everything: the photographs, the coerced participation, the threats against my family, the systematic murder of property owners who opposed Wellington Industries development projects. James provided corroborating testimony about his manipulation and blackmail. The reporters were riveted. The story had everything: multi-generational criminal conspiracy, real estate corruption, family betrayal, and a body count that spanned 4 decades. Mrs. Sullivan, one reporter asked, why are you willing to expose yourself to potential retaliation by going public with this information? Because hiding from criminals doesn't make them go away, I replied. It just gives them more time to find new victims. My son and I were targeted because we were vulnerable and isolated. The best protection against predators is sunlight and community awareness. What message do you have for other families who might be facing similar manipulation? James answered that question. Don't suffer in silence. Don't assume you're protecting people by keeping criminal secrets. And don't believe that cooperation will keep you safe indefinitely. Organizations like the Wellington Network see victims as expendable resources, not protected partners. The press conference made national headlines. By evening, our story was being covered by every major news outlet, with legal experts analyzing the case and law enforcement officials promising investigations into similar operations in other states. More importantly, our public disclosure triggered exactly the response I'd hoped for. Other victims came forward. Within 48 hours of the press conference, the FBI had received over 100 calls from people reporting similar experiences with development companies across New England. Property owners who'd been threatened, construction companies that had been blackmailed, family members of people who'd disappeared after opposing development projects. You were right, Agent Chen told me during a follow-up meeting. Going public made you less valuable as a target and more dangerous to eliminate. We've had no credible threats against either of you since the press conference. And the broader investigation? Your testimony has triggered coordinated investigations in 6 states. We've identified at least 12 other development companies with connections to the Wellington organization. Arrest warrants have been issued for 37 individuals. The criminal network Victoria had helped expose was unraveling rapidly, with each arrest leading to new evidence and additional prosecutions. By making our experience public, James and I had effectively destroyed the secrecy that protected the entire operation. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call that surprised me more than Victoria's job offer had. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Robert Morrison. You probably don't know me. But my father owned the Morrison property downtown that was developed by Wellington Industries 3 years ago. I remembered the Morrison property from the photographs, one of the 7 crime scenes where bodies had been buried under new construction. My father disappeared while opposing their development proposal. The police said he'd probably left town voluntarily, but the family never believed that. After your press conference, we hired a private investigator to review the case. What did you find? Enough evidence to request that the FBI examine the foundation of the building that replaced my father's property. They're planning to excavate next month. If the FBI found Robert Morrison's father's body under that foundation, it would provide physical evidence linking the Wellington organization to specific murders. Combined with James's testimony and my recordings, it would virtually guarantee life sentences for the surviving members of the criminal network. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry for what happened to your father, and I'm sorry my son was involved in covering up the evidence. Mrs. Sullivan, your son was a victim of the same people who killed my father. What matters now is making sure they can't hurt anyone else. The excavation of the Morrison Property Foundation took place on a cold Tuesday morning in March. James and I watched from a distance as FBI forensics teams carefully removed concrete and examined what lay beneath. They found 3 bodies. Robert Morrison's father was there, as expected. But they also found 2 other people who'd been reported missing during the same time period. A neighborhood activist who'd been organizing opposition to Wellington developments, and an environmental lawyer who'd been challenging their permitting applications. The discovery made international news. The Wellington criminal organization had been operating for 43 years, but the physical evidence from the Morrison site provided definitive proof of their methods and confirmed the testimonies James and I had provided. Patricia Wellington, Thomas Wellington, and 4 other family members were sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. 12 associates received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. 6 other development companies in 4 states were shut down as criminal enterprises. Most importantly, the publicity surrounding the case led to legislative changes requiring independent oversight of major development projects, and mandatory reporting systems for construction companies approached with unusual requests. James and I were finally free to rebuild our lives without fear of retaliation. The criminal network that had terrorized our family had been completely destroyed, its leaders imprisoned, its operations exposed and dismantled. But our victory came with a cost neither of us had anticipated. A year after the press conference, James and I met for lunch at a small cafe in Boston's North End. We were both using our real names again, living openly without federal protection, and slowly rebuilding the relationship that Victoria Wellington's manipulation had nearly destroyed. I have something to tell you, James said after we'd ordered. His tone was serious, careful, like someone preparing to deliver difficult news. What is it, sweetheart? I've been offered a job in Seattle, a construction company that specializes in historical restoration. They want someone with experience in complex project management who understands the importance of proper documentation. I smiled, though my heart was breaking a little. That sounds perfect for you. It is perfect. It's everything I wanted to do before I got involved with Victoria's family. Meaningful work, ethical practices, a chance to build things that last instead of what I was doing before. James had spent months in therapy working through the psychological damage from 3 years of coercion and manipulation. He was finally ready to start over, to build a career based on his own values rather than criminal compulsion. When would you start? Next month, if I take it. He paused. I wanted to ask you something first. Of course. Would you consider moving to Seattle with me? Not because I need you there, but because I'd like the chance to have a normal relationship with my mother again. One that isn't based on protection or manipulation or criminal secrets. The offer was tempting. James and I had grown closer during the investigation and prosecution, but we'd never had the opportunity to simply be mother and son without external threats shaping every interaction. James, I appreciate the invitation more than you know, but I think you need to start this new chapter of your life independently, without your mother hovering around, making sure you're okay. I'm not asking you to hover. I'm asking if you'd like to be part of my life as I rebuild it. I thought about it seriously. Moving to Seattle would mean leaving Boston, abandoning the few connections I'd maintained to the life David and I had built together. It would also mean following my son to a new city where neither of us had roots or history. On the other hand, it would mean getting to watch James become the man he was meant to be. free from the guilt and manipulation that had defined his 20s. It would mean building new memories together instead of always processing old trauma. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. The job doesn't start for 6 weeks. That evening, I sat in the small apartment I'd rented after coming out of witness protection, looking through the photographs I'd salvaged from our family home. Pictures of James growing up, family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations. All the normal moments that make up a life before it gets complicated by criminal conspiracies and federal investigations. The truth was, I'd been marking time for the past year, waiting for some sign of what came next. The house where David and I had built our life together was gone. Sullivan & Co. had been dissolved. Most of our possessions had been sold or lost during witness protection. I was 55 years old, with no career, no marriage, no home, and no clear sense of purpose beyond the satisfaction of having helped destroy a criminal organization that had terrorized innocent families for decades. Moving to Seattle with James would give me purpose again, not as a victim or a witness or a crusader for justice, but simply as a mother helping her son build a better life. 2 weeks later, I called James with my decision. "Yes," I said when he answered the phone, "I'd like to move to Seattle with you. Not to hover or manage your life, but to be part of it as you build something new." "Really? You're sure?" "I'm sure, but I have one condition." "Name it." "We find a duplex or something where we can be neighbors instead of roommates. Close enough to have dinner together regularly, far enough apart that you don't feel like your mother is monitoring your recovery." James laughed, the first genuinely carefree laugh I'd heard from him in years. "I think we can manage that." 6 months later, I stood in my new kitchen in a small house in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood, watching James work in his garden next door. He was building raised beds for vegetables, measuring carefully and checking his work twice. Habits inherited from his father and refined by hard experience with the consequences of cutting corners. My phone rang. Agent Chen. "Margaret, I wanted to update you on the final prosecutions. The last of the Wellington associates was sentenced yesterday. 47 people total, with sentences ranging from 10 years to life without parole. And the other investigations? We've identified and shut down similar operations in 8 states. Your decision to go public triggered the largest organized crime prosecution in New England history. Over 200 arrests, with more than 100 convictions so far. The number was staggering. What had started as a son trying to save his mother from humiliation at a dinner party had ended with the destruction of a criminal network that had operated across multiple states for nearly half a century. "There's one more thing," Agent Chen continued. "The families of the victims wanted me to pass along their gratitude. 37 families now have answers about what happened to their missing loved ones. That's because you and James were willing to step forward." After hanging up, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on my front porch, watching my son work in his garden and thinking about the strange twists that had brought us to this quiet morning in Seattle. Victoria Wellington had tried to destroy my family by exploiting our grief and manipulating our vulnerabilities. Instead, her actions had forced us to discover strengths we didn't know we possessed, and had ultimately led to justice for dozens of families who'd been terrorized by the same criminal network. James looked up from his planting and waved. "Coffee smells good from here. Come over when you're done," I called back. "I'll make breakfast." As I watched my son carefully tend his new garden, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or satisfying revenge, but quiet mornings where the people you love are safe to build the lives they choose. Victoria Wellington had been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing. Some foundations, once properly built, really do last forever. The difference was that she'd been trying to build hers on buried secrets and terrified victims. James and I had built ours on truth, courage, and the simple recognition that protecting family sometimes means risking everything you have to fight for what's right. And that foundation was strong enough to support whatever came next.